Hello, welcome everyone. I'm going to give everyone a moment to join and then we'll get started. All right, good afternoon everyone and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar on Thwart Climate Change Now. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. I want to thank you all for attending today. We so appreciate your time and engagement. Additionally, I want to thank our fantastic panelists who are here today and have prepared some content for all of you. Today's webinar will include presentations from the panelists, followed by a roundtable discussion with time at the end for an audience Q&A. Please don't wait to submit your questions though. You can submit them as soon as you think of them by using GoTo's question box. Additionally, today's slides are available on ELI's website along with links to the panelists' full biographies. I'll now turn things over to our wonderful moderator, Maxine. Maxine Joslow is a staff writer at the Washington Post, where she anchors the Climate 202, a daily newsletter about climate change policy and politics. She came to the Post from E&E News, where she spent nearly 5 years covering the intersection of climate change, transportation policy, and environmental law. Maxine's investigative reporting on car companies' early knowledge of climate change has been honored with a Dateline Award from the DC chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Maxine and everyone, thank you so much for being here today, and I will turn things over to you.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Madison, and thanks so much to our panelists for all taking the time to be here today. The presentation is going to be really exciting, but before that, I'm going to introduce all of our panelists and read out their bios. First, we have Bill Kaplan. After a 34-year career in high technology and with an engineer's understanding of sustainability, Bill Kaplan researched the built environment from an environmental perspective for more than a decade, contrasting designers' claims with their ecological veracity. A sober look at our efforts to contain global warming inspired Bill to write Thwart Climate Change Now, Reducing Embodied Carbon Brick by Brick, published in 2021, his third book. Bill has a materials engineering degree from Cornell University and a Master's of Architecture degree from Pratt Institute Graduate School of Architecture. Our next panelist is Ken Berlin. He is the president and CEO of the Climate Reality Project, a 21st century communications and advocacy organization with the mission to catalyze a global solution to the climate crisis by making urgent action a necessity across every level of society. As president and CEO, Ken leads teams in Washington, D.C., 11 branch offices around the world, and over 42,000 climate reality leader activists in 174 countries, working together to confront the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. Prior to joining Climate Reality, Ken chaired the environmental and climate change practices at the globally renowned practice of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom LLP, and served as the executive vice president and general counsel for the Coalition for Green Capital. And of course, Ken is also the former chairman of the Environmental Law Institute. Next, we have Meta Brunzima, who is an architect and urban designer committed to sustainability, equity, and design justice. Meta practices architecture with the Collective for Community, Culture, and Environment, LLC, an all-women-owned consultant and interdisciplinary professional network based in New York City. Meta is also a faculty member at Pratt Institute, where she teaches design, history, and theory. She also leads the Pratt Housing Consortium Decarbonization Working Group. And last but not least, we have Megan Lewis. Megan is a senior researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum, where she leads their efforts to inform effective and just policies to rapidly reduce embodied carbon across public and private construction. Prior to joining CLF, Megan launched the Global Supply Chain Sustainability Program at WeWork. Megan gained her architecture license while practicing at Mithun, where she worked on a range of projects and spearheaded internal LCA and embodied carbon initiatives. Megan has co-authored a range of publications, including the CLF's Policy, Owner, and Architect Toolkits and the book Green Building Materials Manual. So that's it for our panelist introductions. And with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Bill for his presentation.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to 2022. It's time to fight climate change. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Environmental Law Institute for shining light on the urgent need for climate action and the need to address embodied carbon. I'd like to thank Madison Calhoun, Senior Manager of ELI's Educational Programs, for making this webinar happen. Also, a special thank you to Ken Berlin, Maida Brunzimmer, Megan Lewis, and our moderator, Maxine Chasselau, for donating their time to this important issue. Researching this book, I've uncovered some unsettling things that I would like to share with you. I hope they will be eye-openers. I come from a world of precision engineering, 34 years at the firm I founded. We designed sensors for programs such as the Space Shuttle, the Mars Lander, advanced weapons, and nuclear testing. There was little room for error. Failure was not an option, nor is failure an option when fighting climate change, where 40% of our energy-related emissions come from the built environment. Reducing emissions has been a priority for more than 20 years. Yet much of what I've learned about the efficacy of green building, of sustainable design, is disconcerting. In reality, in practice, we are not doing enough. As a result, curbing net emissions from the building sector will await the arrival of carbon-free energy worldwide. I don't want to sound like Chicken Little. The sky isn't falling yet, but it's time to look up. With global warming nearly a quarter degree from reaching the 1.5 degree Celsius targeted cap, let's hope we get there in time. But sadly, our pathways to net zero provide a myriad of opportunities for failure, while time is of the essence. Oh, there we go. The emphasis of Thwart Climate Change Now is on the now, meaning the 2020, 2 years of which have already passed. Why the 2020s? After all, some countries have pledged net zero as early as 2050, and there are multiple pathways to limit warming within 1.5 to 2 degrees. What's the rush? That depends on the answers to 2 questions. The first, how many more tons of carbon can we emit before the warming gets out of hand? Second, what is the status of decarbonization? If the answers are troublesome, what can we do about it? Let's cut to the chase and see where we stand. Let's look at 2 current reports, Climate Change 2021 from the IPCC and the Emissions Gap report from the UN. These graphs depict the change of global temperature. The left over the last 2,000 years, the right from pre-industrial 1850 to 2020. As Al Gore said, there are some inconvenient truths. Here's one from the IPCC. Human influence has warmed the climate at an unprecedented rate. Let's look closer. Although temperatures stayed within the plus or minus quarter degree bandwidth for the 2,000 years prior to 1900, since 1900, they increased more than 1 degree C. Notice the alarming increase since 1970, followed by nearly half a degree from 2000 to 2020. The second inconvenient truth is that atmospheric carbon has also increased at an alarming rate since 1970, accelerating since 2000. In 1910, it reached 300 parts per million, a 300,000-year high. Over the next 50 years, 1910 to 1960, it increased only a mere 17 parts per million, 5.7%. But since 2000, Atmospheric carbon has increased more than 5% each decade, 25 parts per million, 6.6%, in just the last 10 years. Temperature increases are nearly linear with the increase in atmospheric carbon. Science tells us that emissions are the cause, rising temperatures the effect. Quoting directly from Climate Change 2021, every ton of CO2 emissions adds to global warming. The third inconvenient truth is that the Paris pathway timelines are based on a bad bet. Only a 66% likelihood of success. This page is from the Emissions Gap Report. The Paris Agreement pathways and their timelines to reach net zero. Ask yourself, are you willing to bet the planet's future with 66% odds? Years of negotiations, of planning, enormous efforts and expenditures, all with a 1 in 3 chance of failure. So let's move on from that. How do we improve the odds? I need a slide change here. For some insights, let's look at the carbon budget table. It's in the Climate Change Report. The carbon budget is a more tangible way to quantify the immediate challenge. It addresses the volume of carbon that we are allowed to emit until we reach net zero. Unlike many targets based on arbitrary reference years long past, such as 1990 and 2005, this budget is calculated from the beginning of 2020. The calculations also account for the warming for the other greenhouse gases, the CO2 equivalents, which are reflected in the results. And we are provided with a range of likelihoods from 17 to 83%. Let's up the odds. 83% is a better bet than 66. To hold global warming to 1.5 degrees allows for cumulative emissions of 300 gigatons until we reach net zero. That's 300 billion metric tons from the beginning of 2020. Defaulting to the 2-degree target, we can triple allowable emissions to 900 billion metric tons. These seem like large numbers. Let's see what they imply. This is a graph of annual greenhouse gas emissions from 1970 through 2020. The red annotations are mine. Fossil CO2 emissions are the largest, bright purple. Methane and other greenhouse gases add to the total. Their warming per gigaton is actually greater than CO2, but they are emitted in lower volumes. And while CO2 can remain in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, methane will dissipate in a decade or two. So let's look at CO2 alone, the basis for the carbon budget. Orange is CO2 emissions from land use changes, and forestry. The total has been above 40 gigatons per year for nearly a decade. We've already reversed the 2020 COVID dip way on the right. If we can stay within this range, what does the future look like? At 40 gigatons per year, we will exceed the remaining 300 gigaton carbon budget for 1.5 degrees in 2027, only 5 years from now. And with it, our 80% chance for success. Even our shot at 2 degrees does not look good. At 40 gigatons per year, we have only until 2042, while the world's largest emitters have targeted net zero at 2050, 60, and beyond. Our transition to net zero relies on carbon-free energy from renewables. Let's check their progress. Parsing reports on renewable energy can be head-spinning. They focus on growth, glowing pronouncements in the summaries, but sobering qualifiers in the details. are a few examples. Despite COVID-19, and these are from 2020, renewable energy set a record for new capacity. There we go. Oh, there we go. Okay. Renewable capacity, power capacity surpassed the previous record. I think Solar had another record-breaking year. Wind power, another record breaker for new installations. Slide. There we go. Okay. Etc. This all sounds great, but they all refer to new capacity, not their total generation. Hyperbole, perhaps. A record-breaking increase of something small to begin with can be small overall. A real indicator of how we are doing is the percentage of total energy that comes from carbon-free renewables, not just their growth. Whenever I bring up that subject, electricity is the milestone that's proffered to exemplify how far we have come. 26% of the global electricity consumed in 2019 was generated from renewables, the last year before COVID skewed the numbers. 26% is an excellent accomplishment, but unfortunately, electricity accounted for only 17% of the total final energy consumption, the TFEC. In other words, electricity from renewables was a mere 4.4% of total energy consumed, 26% of that 17%. Heat energy is 51% of our energy consumption worldwide. Renewables generated about 10% of that. Therefore, heat from renewables was only 5% of total energy consumption. Likewise, transportation renewables were merely 1% of total energy use. In total, energy accounted for about 11% of global energy consumption. The US percentage was similar. But there's something that gets lost in the messaging, and that's that not all renewable energy is carbon-free. Biomass energy released 350 million metric tons of carbon dioxide from the US alone. That's in 2019. Biomass carbon emissions per BTU of energy are actually higher than petroleum, and they're 1.5 times natural gas. In 2019, US biomass energy was twice hydro, twice wind, 5.5 times solar, and 24 times geothermal. It represents 40% of our renewable generation. But biomass emissions are not even tallied as energy-related emissions. The IPCC considers them neutral. This is a pie chart of US energy consumption in 2020, a COVID lockdown year. It highlights the dominance of biomass in the renewable sector. The red highlighting is mine. But to achieve net zero, we need energy that is carbon-free. In 2019, total carbon-free energy in the United States constituted 14.9% of consumption. But a whopping 57% of that was from nuclear. Carbon-free renewables constituted a mere 6.4% of total US energy consumption. We are not well on the way to decarbonization. Our journey to net zero will take a lot longer than advertised. So how do we buy time now in the 2020s? An important part of that answer lies with reducing embodied carbon. When we speak about reducing emissions, typically the energy supply comes to mind. reducing operating emissions, more efficient appliances and equipment, more efficient buildings, energy efficient buildings. These are absolute musts. But thwarting global warming is not a function of the amount of energy we consume. It is the release of its carbon content, its carbon emissions. Absent from that discussion are embodied emissions, also known as embodied carbon. The carbon footprint to manufacture materials and equipment and to construct buildings and infrastructure. Embodied emissions are released over the entire life cycle of a product or an assembly, from cradle to grave or to reuse. In their broadest definition, they include all carbon gases emitted during processing, manufacturing, and assembly from everything we produce, including agricultural products. This includes raw material extraction, transportation, installation, maintenance, and even eventual discard. Embodied emissions are often taken for granted, a necessary fact of life, or are too perplexing to resolve. Unfortunately, embodied emissions are the first to be released before any product is purchased, before any building is occupied, before any infrastructure is used. They accelerate global warming in real time, way before benefits from energy efficiencies accumulate. Embodied emissions are the first tally of sustainability. Operating emissions, excuse me, are the, are the second part of the equation. Operating savings can depend on the weather, the economy, good practices, or the occupants' functional choices. They can also be improved upon in future years. Unfortunately, embodied emissions are locked in up front. They cannot be mitigated. Over the next 5 years, 75% of cumulative emissions from new buildings will come from their embodied emissions. 10 years out, they will still equate to 60% of the total. But there is good news to be had. Reducing new embodied carbon can be addressed immediately with the next building or infrastructure design, with the next appliance or vehicle conceived. Embodied carbon is a function of material demand. Choices up and down the line matter, from mining to manufacturing, from packaging to transportation to material choice itself. All these are key to reducing net carbon emissions within the 2020s. Designing more energy efficient buildings and renovations is essential, as is selecting more energy efficient appliances and building systems, more solar power, wind power, and electric vehicles are also a must. But we cannot continue to take their embodied carbon for granted. It can take a decade or more of operating gains to merely offset their upfront embodied emissions. They must be factored in framing every policy and incentive. So what's in the way? With all the attention focused on global warming, carbon emissions, and green buildings, our love affair with green and sustainable often interferes. They have become little more than labels. Add to that incomplete or misinformation, weak regulation of green building certifications, insufficient tools to evaluate materials and methods, the cover of sustainable design, the lack of participation from the architecture and construction professions, and the most used building material on the planet, concrete. Twice as much concrete is used in construction as all other building materials combined. Concrete itself is not the problem. It's the binder that secures the mix, the cement. More than 4 billion metric tons were produced in 2020, spewing 2 billion metric tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. Half of cement's emissions are a chemical byproduct from breaking down limestone at 1400 degrees Celsius, a reaction that releases CO2. But here's the worst part. Only 40% of those emissions result from burning fossil fuels. Only those emissions can be eliminated by fuel source decarbonization, less than half of cement's emissions. Cement concrete is also used to fabricate a large array of products, not just construction, from ornamental flower pots, garden sculptures and furniture, to building ornamentation, roof tiles, facade panels, and institutional interiors. Concrete is an architecture style in itself, even for buildings touted as sustainably designed. Cement manufacturing, one building material alone, is responsible for 7 to 8% of the world's energy-related emissions. Now, that is not a secret. Yet even within the industry, misleading claims and about products and materials are abundant, even about the use of concrete and therefore cement. Over the last 3 years, as this book was emerging, claims that easily mislead, such as this full-page ad, became more prominent in print and on the internet. This ad ran in the 2020 issue of Architect, the journal of the American Institute of Architects. The issue featured an article on decarbonization, so this was very appropriate. The ad was placed by Build with Strength, a coalition of the National Ready Mixed Concrete Association. Per the ad, the coalition consists of civic organizations, fire safety professionals, architects, engineers, and industry experts. The ad states that Build with Strength is committed to enacting more sustainable building standards. The headline reads, "What building material absorbs carbon for the entire lifespan of the building? Concrete is the answer." True. Exposed concrete surfaces do absorb carbon dioxide slowly over time, as do some rocks and even soil. But the decades required for meaningful absorption nowhere near compensate the enormous emissions spewed daily by cement manufacturing. No, concrete is not the answer to stave off carbon emissions, though someone reading this AIA journal advertisement might be influenced to believe so. This is the Thomas P. Murphy Design Studio at the University of Miami School of Architecture, completed in 2018. The Architects newspaper reported the design was meant to be a teaching tool to inspire future architects, to showcase the basics of modern design, construction, and sustainability. This is a LEED certified building. LEED certification conveys an aura of sustainable design. Green building certification programs, such as LEED and UK's BREEAM, have changed the face of the green building movement, both in the public's view and in architects' understanding of what can be achieved. LEED, an acronym for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, was developed by the US Green Building Council. By late 2021, nearly 24 billion square feet of commercial, residential, and government projects were LEED registered and certified. More than 100,000 projects in 182 countries and territories. UK's BREEAM certified more than 500,000 buildings, with 2 million more projects registered for certification. The United States General Service Administration, GSA, requires a LEED Gold rating as the minimum requirement for new construction or substantial renovation of GSA-owned facilities. Does any of this require a net low carbon design, one that addresses its own carbon footprint? No. To be fair, the design of this building addresses the sun's position during the hottest months, with a 25-foot roof extension to shade the glass facade. The overhang curves down at the southern corner, a wink towards sustainable design. It is true that the mass of concrete helps to maintain interior temperatures under a hot sun, and the building's large high-tech glass windows provide plenty of natural light while reflecting the sun's heat. Perhaps these features helped it become LEED certified. Nonetheless, these sustainable characteristics do not justify the building's unnecessary contributions to global warming. Carbon emissions from the excessive use of concrete emitted in bulk before the first student entered. The 25-foot overhang in Florida's climate may well be a valid sustainability appendage, but not when constructed from concrete. One can question the use of concrete for the entire roof and some of the walls as well. This is not unique to the University of Miami School of Architecture. Many architecture schools, as well as institutions and commercial and residential ventures around the world, are styled with a concrete aesthetic. But please note, a green building certification, not even if gold or platinum, guarantees a low carbon footprint or even low overall emissions. To quote a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, referring to his firm's LEED Platinum building, an AIA Top 10 Green Projects winner. My own aha moment on this front was when my firm calculated all the embodied carbon emitted. It's a very efficient project and has performed better than expected. But when we ran all the numbers, we found that construction still emitted 1,000 tons of carbon, roughly the same as 10 years of operating emissions. This is a building on William Street in New York City's financial district, completed in 2020, a 66-story, 800-foot tall residential tower with a curtain wall facade. The entire building is clad with hand-cast concrete panels. To my knowledge, the building is not LEED certified, and the building makes no specific claim of sustainability. Nonetheless, according to their website, the architects strive to create an environmentally responsible future, and they practice sustainable architecture. The fact that concrete is a component of this building is not the issue. Rather, it's the overabundance. This massive use of concrete has emitted significant embodied emissions, just for an aesthetic statement. This is gratuitous carbon. An abundance of concrete should be neither a teaching tool nor a design aesthetic to emulate. There are many low carbon means to effectuate a design statement. That's what architects are trained to envision and to execute. Nonetheless, with all this misleading headlines, marketing misinformation, a reliance on the veracity of green building certifications, on green appendages like solar panels and green roofs, even trained professionals can be easily confused. And worst of all, they lack the tools to evaluate carbon content in a timely manner and to evaluate construction methodologies as well. Perhaps that's why only a small percentage of architecture firms in 2020 took part in the AIA's 2030 Commitment Program, a program established in 2009. The 2030 Commitment encourages architects, engineers, and design professionals to take robust action to achieve a carbon neutral built environment by 2030. But only 782 out of 19,000 AIA member-owned firms were signatories in 2020. Of those, only 378 firms reported their predicted energy use intensity reductions, nearly 15 of which met the 2020 intensity target. Only 55 firms reported embodied carbon. Notwithstanding the steady increase in signatories over the last 10 years and the best average reduction in the commitment's history, 95% of AIA member-owned firms remain aloof. What about the growth in zero energy buildings, those with on-site energy capture and generation? Doesn't that define sustainable architecture? As you can see in this chart from the New Buildings Institute, there has been a tremendous growth in net zero building projects. Nearly 700 projects in North America were tracked in 2020. 500 additional projects were in process, and there are many more not tracked by the NBI. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, zero energy building produces enough renewable energy to meet its own annual energy consumption, thereby reducing the use of non-renewable energy. The building's energy needs must be balanced by on-site renewable generation. But balanced means that on-site renewable energy may be exported. It can be swapped for imported fossil fuel energy to be used on-site. And it's really not clear if all of the exported renewable energy is actually distributed and then consumed. Zero energy buildings are designed to reduce energy consumption, and that's operating energy. Embodied emissions are not part of the equation. Zero energy buildings are hard to achieve. They require engineering precision plus architectural finesse. But success often depends on energy efficient occupant behavior. Their overall value to curb emissions, while often beneficial, can be overstated. A zero energy building can rely on excessive insulation, triple pane windows, and other carbon intensive materials to minimize the thermal losses. They do not guarantee a lifetime reduction in carbon emissions, nor must they minimize their upfront carbon footprint. Which brings us back to the main point of this webinar. Now, the remainder of the 2020s. We are not decarbonizing the world's energy supply fast enough. We are not accumulating gains from energy efficient buildings and appliances fast enough. We emit more emissions from new manufacturing and construction than we will save from their operating efficiencies in their first 10 years of use. Architects and designers lack the tools to compare material alternatives in a timely manner. There is little policy, legislation, or even common sense activity to reduce embodied carbon, while we continue to release embodied emissions at an unprecedented rate, exacerbating global warming in real time. A good portion of these emissions can be reduced commencing this year, 2022, just by curbing material excess. Reducing the annual use of cement by just 15% will immediately eliminate more than 300 million metric tons of CO2 per year, approximately 1 gigaton every 3 years. Think about that. And that's just for one material. Many more gigatons can be eliminated through material choice. Reducing the buildup of embodied emissions at this moment is essential. We must consider the next 10 years as a special carve-out, an exception, our temporary vaccine against climate change. This requires us to take action over the next 5 years. That means weighing embodied carbon impact in policy incentives and providing local building legislation to cap it. That means activating architects and engineers to participate now. They are the ones who detail buildings and construction, who provide clients their options to choose from. That means providing the tools to compute embodied carbon, especially carbon footprint labeling. It also means educating consumers whose purchases impact the supply chain and its replenishment. There are examples and specific actions described in my book. Unfortunately, I don't have the time here to present them. So I will hand the mic to Maxine and the panel with the following challenge. How do we activate embodied carbon action from 2022 to 2027? Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Bill, for the really illuminating presentation. I think that was really a fantastic presentation and gives us a lot to talk about among all of these great panelists. So there was one audience question that came in for Bill during the presentation. I'm going to hold off on that just for a moment, just because I want to get to our great panelists. And I want to start with you, Ken, for the first question. And this is a question that Bill and I had talked about ahead of time, asking you, Ken. And the Climate Reality Project, which you lead, has trained more than 42,000 activists around the world to press for climate action and clean energy. Can that model of grassroots activism work to reduce embodied carbon within the next 5 years from 2022 to 2027, not just by influencing policies related to buildings and construction, but influencing consumer behavior as well?
Well, thank you, Maxine, and thank you, Bill, for the very, very interesting presentation. Let me just start off by talking about the steps that I would take in trying to figure out how to develop a campaign, within Climate Reality Project or within the entire environmental community to really address this issue. And the first step on that is to really figure out, what role can the government play through incentives and legislation or building codes, or through regulations, through legislation of building codes that really enable progress to be made on addressing embodied carbon. So, in other words, how do we go about this? What are we looking for to support in this grassroots campaign? Once you decide on that, you've got to draft the provisions, obviously, either legislation, local building codes, whatever you're working on. And then you have to decide how you go about getting them passed. If it's legislation, for example, at local, state, or federal level, do you draft specific legislation on this? Do you draft standalone legislation, or do you attach it to other legislation as you go forward? I'll discuss that in a minute. And what's your best approach? Do we want to look at it from Climate Reality, the Environmental Community Project, on the federal level, the state, or the local level? For example, you theoretically on the federal level could pass regulations relating to cement, or legislation relating to cement. You may need legislation before you can do regulation. So again, what's our approach to this? What's the most efficient approach, and how well do you want to do it? If you're going on a legislative route, we'd have to find sponsors, in the federal government, in the House of Representatives or the Senate. In the state government, we'd have to find local supporters, and even at a local level, you need to find people, your representatives, who are working on this issue and care about it. So again, it's a process first of developing what you're doing, figuring out what you're saying, and then you've got to figure out how to make it attractive so that you can in fact develop some sort of grassroots campaign, or in our case, we can get our members involved. And when I say our members, our trained leaders, we train leaders in either 3-day in-person trainings or 9-day virtual trainings. We do lots of follow-up when we do that. But how do we get them interested in this issue? And when it comes to grassroots campaigns or working with members, there are really 3 different ways to do this. And let me just describe each one briefly. The first one, of course, is you can do general grassroots work. We can go out to our members and say, we want you to back measures that directly affect embodied carbon. Or we could do it indirectly, saying we want you to back measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions by regulating cement, and and doing it on a broader basis. The question is, can we come up with a compelling message that gets people interested in this process? It's difficult. There are a lot of different competing factors in getting grassroots campaigns going. There are lots of other issues out there. The more obscure and technical the issue is, the harder it is. Talking about embodied carbon, for example, would be pretty complicated for people to understand because it's indirect. It's an indirect issue. So again, maybe better off going broader on something like cement, but that's another issue. So the first thing is, do you do general grassroots work? The second option you have in getting this through, and we would, for example, have a reasonable share of members, of trained leaders who understand this and could do it, but between the entire environmental community, there may be more. Do you go and try and do a campaign that involves as many people who know about this issue and care about this issue as possible. You know, do we want to get architects? Do we want to get, you know, green building council members? Do we want to get the groups that the other speakers here represent involved in this? And then you organize and get, you know, individuals or groups of individuals to meet with their representatives to talk about this issue and get them to support the issue going forward. The other option you have is to do legislation and attach it to a broader piece of legislation. For example, if you want to regulate cement, you may not have a bill regulating cement. You may have something that you draft as a portion of a bill to regulate cement, and for example, push it into something like energy efficiency legislation as part of it. I haven't really thought it through enough to know if that's the right way, but you want to attach it to something else that's easier for people to understand and get involved in that. And so it becomes an issue where you now say to in our case, we say to our members, we generally lobby through chapters, although we do it through individuals broadly, although we do it through individuals who might be able to influence legislation. You know, do you say to them, we want you to back this bill and it's got 3 critical provisions, one of which are the embodied carbon provisions or the cement provision, however you put it. So you've got the option of either doing this directly. You have the option of doing it through influencers and people who know the legislation and know the issues, or you have the option of doing it by attaching to a piece of legislation where there needs to be less general understanding of this, and you combine a bunch of issues to make them more attractive to your members to work on. That's sort of the general way I would look at it. You know, generally in our organization, we concentrate a lot more on trying to get things through at the government level, through legislation or regulation or building codes, whatever the issue is, not trying to go to consumers directly. There are just too many consumers out there. You know, there are 300 million Americans, and we have, you know, we've got 42,000 climate realities. Our mailing list covers 1.2 million people, and we have lots of other supporters aside from our leaders, but still that's a tiny fraction of people out there. And, you know, we could encourage people to do that. If we got involved in this issue, we can encourage people to do something, whatever it is here that would be helpful. But we would regard that as less important than going after, you know, major effort through, again, legislation, regulation, building codes, whatever's appropriate here. So with that, I'll stop. I hope that's helpful, and thank you.
Thanks, Ken, for the very comprehensive answer. And I wanted to make sure I got to the other 2 panelists we haven't heard from yet. So Meta, this question is directed at you, and it's about local law 97 in New York City, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, passed in 2019, limits operating emissions for large buildings constructed as of 2024. Given this focus that Bill wants us to have, and rightly so, on reducing embodied carbon from now to 2027 over the next 5 years. Do you think that law can be expanded to include embodied emissions? And because it becomes effective within 5 years of its passage, can we achieve a timeline to limit embodied emissions in the 2020s?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Bill, for a wonderful book and a wonderful presentation. So based on Bill's findings, we definitely should include embodied carbon into the local law 97 equation, which it is currently missing in the local law 97. And I do hope that, you know, embodied carbon will become part of the larger discussion. I'm not a policy expert, but I do know that either the building code could be amended, special legislation could be enacted, and incentives could be provided, you know, to help building professionals look at embodied carbon in a more, you know, targeted way. I do like Controller Brad Lander's idea of using pension fund money to create climate loans. I like Governor Bill Murphy of New Jersey's idea of, actually it's a bill to essentially provide tax incentives for using lower carbon concrete. So we're already sort of a little bit on the way. But before we talk about, get into the debate about what kinds of policies we would want, you know, to sort of ameliorate local law 97, let's talk about the big picture. For those of you who are not totally familiar with local law 97, you have to kind of understand the bigger picture of what it will in fact catalyze. I mean, it will really result in a tsunami of building retrofits in New York City, primarily for buildings that are larger than 25,000 square feet. And so the first Local Law 97 milestone is 2024, and the next one is 2030. And architects and engineers are working right now on specifying the materials of hundreds, if not thousands, of buildings. So what we're going to see are like thousands of building envelopes and windows being replaced, structural upgrades, facades, windows, insulation. And you just have to think about the hundreds, if not thousands, of buildings of the mid-century that actually have zero insulation. So many of those will have very radical facade improvements that will require materials like insulation, like new facade materials. And so that is really where the embodied carbon question comes in. Which materials are we choosing for that? Are we going for brick? Are we going for this type of insulation or another one? So for me, right now, in order to sort of expedite the embodied carbon discussion relative to Local Law 97, I feel that we need more information out there. So I think the government, academic institutions, nonprofits, you know, and panels like this really help to actually get the message out. And because we really sort of need to know better what the problem is and why we're in fact doing it. And second, I feel that we need to actually look at the embodied carbon situation in a more sophisticated way, by thinking not only about the entire life cycle of the material, but also really connecting everything from the sort of biological, the forest itself, to the building, and really understanding the territorial implications of the impact of materials on, of course, carbon emissions, but also on, you know, other issues like toxicity, you know, inequality, etc. So by looking at materials more at a more granular scale and understanding the territorial implications of materials, I think we will achieve multiple benefits, including carbon. And I think we also, you know, need to really make this kind of approach to life cycle analysis and circular economy a much greater part of the discussion in the architectural and building sector circles.
Great, thank you, Meta. Before I move on to Megan, did any of the other panelists want to chime in on Local Law 97? Or if not, I'll move on to the question I had for Megan.
Well, I actually do have one thing to add, Maxine, if I may, very briefly. You know, Bill really emphasized the issue of now and the urgency of now. And so the problem really is not even to sort of like make this happen, but making this happen very quickly. And it turns out that there's a group of social scientists, political scientists, historians that actually have looked into this on how to accelerate transitions, socio-technical transitions and system innovations. So I just wanted to point to two sort of lessons that I learned from the field of what's called transition management. And one is, you know, whenever we try to innovate, for example, let's say we want to have a lot of options that are inexpensive for bio-based and low carbon insulation facade retrofits for Local Law 97. So one of their suggestions is to create what they call innovation niches, meaning sort of incubators for innovation that are supported by either the public sector, but also are linked into what they call the landscape, which is the larger population. And so in other words, creating a network at multiple levels of understanding where innovations are produced. So that could be competitions, that could be you know, pilot projects, that could be essentially projects that are that become examples that then inform other levels of understanding, you know, and I think this would work really, really well for the embodied carbon question. Other takeaway from the transition management science is that it's very important to change the dominant narrative, okay? So just like one may want to change a dominant narrative from a care-based health, from a treatment-based healthcare to a prevention-based healthcare, one could really start to change the dominant narrative from a carbon-emitting, you know, material choice to a carbon sequestering set material choices. So I think, you know, we have to sort of think big and try to understand these as paradigm shifts.
Thank you, Meta, for elaborating on that. Appreciate that. And Megan, sorry to keep you waiting, but did want to make sure I asked you about your work at the Carbon Leadership Forum, where you look at embodied carbon policy. And some cities and states have already introduced embodied carbon policy or legislation that can be modeled or replicated by others. So what are some of those cities and states to watch in this space? And are any of those policies intended to limit embodied carbon within a 5-year time frame that we've talked about?
Yep, thanks for, that's a great question. There's so many examples actually to pull from, and I'm going to try to pick some, pick a short list on the state, local, and actually the federal level. We're starting to see some movement here. And so I'll start with the state level, because I think that's really where it started to move in the United States. And I think that that's the precedent that's started to be followed by the federal government. So one note quickly, just sort of on types of policies, the frameworks that can address embodied carbon that we're seeing is there's a group of policies that's more been advanced in Canada and Europe that focus on reducing embodied carbon at the scale of the building. And those really focus on incentivizing designers and so architects and engineers to build buildings differently. In the US, where we've started is more focused on materials manufacturing, so driving down embodied carbon through lower carbon supply chains. And in particular, there's a policy called Buy Clean that is popular in the US. So the first version of this was passed in California in 2017. And so that actually this year, speaking of things that will be, that will start to make changes now, this January, they introduced limits. And so what that means is that for steel and certain kinds of insulation and glass that are used on California state projects, those now have to meet carbon footprint limits that are set by the state. And that 9 states introduced versions of that policy last year. Colorado now also has that policy. Those limits for Colorado will be introduced in 2024. And this is sort of the lead by example, the idea where the government starts to create a market for these low carbon materials, and those can then be used by the private sector. And New York also had some movement on that type of procurement policy, really focused on concrete last year, and just yesterday introduced a more ambitious version of the bill that was passed last year, which is called the Climate Forward Concrete Leadership Act. So that's something to watch in New York State. And at the local level, a couple examples I'll give are, so the city of Portland has been a leader on embodied carbon policy. They have a low carbon concrete policy that, again, focuses on city projects. So it's important to note that not only buildings have high embodied carbon footprints, but also the next time you go on a walk, look at everything around you, the sidewalks, the sewers beneath you, everything is made with these carbon intensive materials. And so one of the things they've done that's really interesting is focus more on those sort of infrastructure, and they have some pilot projects on that and how they can drive down that carbon, and they'll also be setting limits for their city projects this year. Marin County is the first precedent in the US, which is just north of San Francisco, for what building code could look like. And the New Building Institute actually also just published a lot of model language for what embodied carbon, how embodied carbon could be integrated into building code. And that sets submit limits and also has some performance-based requirements for driving down embodied carbon, focused again on concrete. And then last couple things I'll mention. So we're starting to see embodied carbon in a lot of city green building incentive programs. Those have a really broad set of, those really look different in every city, but it's one place that I encourage people to look if they're wondering if their city's thinking about embodied carbon. And another to sort of mix in some East Coast examples instead of just always focusing on the West Coast, where I'm located. But City of Boston was just looking at how to integrate embodied carbon into their zoning. And they've also recently launched a mass timber accelerator. And I think we might end up talking about mass timber later in this panel, but focusing more on the education. So not as much, we don't know exactly what the impact could be in the next 5 years. But as I think many of the other panelists mentioned, this is a really tricky issue to get people engaged with. And so education is a really big part of it. And that's part of what that program is focused on.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And thanks for wrapping up the East Coast perspective into this, since I'm from just outside of Boston and was glad to hear you mention Boston too. We are getting some audience questions in the chat. Just a reminder, you can type audience questions in the chat and I will read them out as we get them. And the first one we got while Bill was speaking, actually, so I'm overdue for asking this one, was a clarifying question about your presentation, Bill. And this person was surprised that when you do, he said, were the numbers regarding biomass emissions compared to other energy sources on an LCA or life cycle assessment basis. And this person was surprised that the LCA biomass is more than a wind turbine or a solar panel, and wanted you to explain more.
Okay, well, I think there are two different subjects here. Okay, first of all, the data, was computed from the monthly energy reports for the U.S. And so there are two things that I was trying to point out. Okay, one was that if you look at the energy consumption, or the BTU consumption of energy for each of the sources, and you then look at in that same given year the emissions coming from those sources, the surprising thing was, although perhaps it really shouldn't be surprising, is that, per heat energy or BTU energy, when using the biomass fuels, it's actually, there are more emissions than you get from burning oil, and a lot more from burning natural gas. And so here, in this transition, we talk about using biofuels as one of them, but in fact, you would be better off with natural gas than biofuels. Now, when I talked about that it was twice hydro, et cetera, what I'm talking about there is that if you go back to the chart of how much energy is generated or consumed, from where hydro is the source, or solar is the source, et cetera, out of the renewable batch. If you find out, what you discover is that biomass is actually generating the biggest share of all of the renewable energies. And so the generation from biofuel is twice the generation, from hydroelectric. And I don't have a chart in front of me, but that's what those numbers were. So I mean, we're really fooling ourselves, when we talk about, how well are we doing with renewable energy. Now, if you want to make a statement, as IPCC did in 2006, that biofuels are neutral, well, then there's nothing to talk about. But I think the consensus now is that that's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, first of all, when you grow trees, it takes a long time to grow them, and then they, in fact, are sequestering carbon. But now when you take a tree and cut it down, and in fact, even just turning them into pellets, to burn, that takes energy. So that's part of the embodied carbon in the pellet. But then when you burn the wood pellets, which are called, I think, modern renewables, actually. The old-fashioned biomass is you take the log and throw it into your stove. But so when you burn the pellets, the emissions are going right back in the air. And so it's going to take an awful long time to replace, to suck the carbon out of the air to grow new trees. But even, when you talk about, let's say ethanol or, from corn or other products, the agricultural industry itself is generating a lot of emissions. Tilling the land releases carbon dioxide by tilling the soil, and then the power required for the tractors and on, and creating the fertilizers that are used, that whole industry. That is also releasing carbon. The concept that I now have some biomaterial, which at the moment is sequestering carbon, and then let's go burn it and put CO2 in the atmosphere. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. The whole idea is to try to cut our emissions now, not trade them. So that's where that was all coming from.
Got it. Thank you, Bill.
Okay.
Thanks for that. And now we actually have a couple of questions coming in for all of the panelists. So this next question, anyone who wants to take a stab at it, please go ahead. And this person said, can anyone comment on the sustainability of the following building materials, including life cycle and production, recycled glass, and cross-laminated timber?
I'll give you a few comments on that. So first of all, any material that's recycled, if it's a high recycled content, is already cutting down the embodied carbon, the potential embodied carbon. So yes, recycled glass is a lot better than making new glass. I'm sorry, what was the second part? The other part of the question?
It was the sustainability of
comparing it to just glass, recycled glass versus glass.
Okay.
And then
I'll just make another comment. Is there any way that I can share a screen? I guess not. Okay. So in the book, I have a table in the book which it lists a bunch of building materials from the highest carbon footprint by mass to the lowest. And I put it in there to show you that it's really the quantity of use that matters. And so when you're ranking materials by their emissions per unit of mass, at the top of the list is aluminum. And the number 2 is PVC and vinyl. And number 3 is steel sections. And number 4 is glass for glazing. And then in the middle is cement. And then comes ceramic tile and cladding. And then clay tile, common brick, and concrete is at the bottom. So the worst material on this list by mass is aluminum. Okay, and the best material on this list by mass is actually concrete. Okay, but that's by mass. It's now a question of how much of these materials do you use? And so when you now look at how they're used in construction, you can almost flip this upside down, because the worst is going to be concrete. And, you use a lot more concrete, as a structurally for the building than you do steel. But steel is a lot worse, per kilogram of mass in emissions than the concrete is. So it's the same thing. So aluminum, which is the worst, a lot of energy goes into making aluminum, but we tend to use aluminum, in thin sections. It's not a structural material. And so even, you take PVC, which I think a lot of us have always said, well, this is horrible, it's a petroleum product. Well, it's a question of how much PVC you use, because, PVC, first of all, once you make it, it's sequestering the embodied carbon. So, it's only if you start to burn it or something, that's going to go back into the atmosphere. And so when you look at, PVC or vinyl cladding, the instinct might be, well, this is not very good. But I was shocked myself when I began to look at these various things and say, well, actually, it's a lot better than brick. So you really need to think it's the mass of these materials that makes the big difference. Now, I know the other part of the question was the wood. Now, wood is incredible. I mean, because wood is sequestering the carbon. So now it does take energy, to dress the wood, to cut it and to prepare it into whatever shape it's going to be for use in architectural purposes. And I think, if I remember right, that it was about maybe 1/3 of the embodied carbon in wood. The embodied carbon, is coming really from dressing the wood, and it represents about 1/3 of the embodied carbon that's actually already sequestered in the wood. So when you use wood, it's actually it's a positive thing. I mean, it's a negative emission. It's holding it. There's wood in buildings that's hundreds of years old. I think Meta will tell me there's thousands-year-old wood, which is true. So you can't do better than wood, which segues to, I can't help it, but to the use of timber and wood. And maybe, Megan, you can address some of that, with the building codes.
I'd love to jump in here. I can touch on that, but also I think it's just really important to step back. Anytime you find yourself asking the question, is this material good for embodied carbon? I'd say compared to what? And I think it's really important to stay away from thinking that we're going to have rules of thumb for embodied carbon, because unfortunately it's just not that easy. So in the context of, let's say, glass, is recycled glass compared to normal glass better? I think, Bill touched on that. But what is the best available material to create a transparent surface to let daylight and views into your building? That's the way to address that question. What materials can you compare that meet the same functional performance? And I think there's a lot of tools that are available now for architects that they can already integrate into their design process to think about these problems in that way, rather than thinking about them in the way that I see a lot of people approach them, similar to thinking about health and toxicity questions, which is it feels more of a yes, no. Is this toxic or is this not toxic? And I don't want this near my body. Versus embodied carbon is more thinking about a building having a carbon budget, sort of like what Bill was touching on earlier, where I want there to be as little carbon embodied in this building as possible. And what are the choices that I have to make that happen? And so, we're not going to start, we can't just say concrete is bad, so therefore we're going to get rid of all concrete. We still need bridges, we still need roads. There are lots of things where we still need to use these materials, but that doesn't mean we can't use the best available version of those materials at the same time that we're coming up with technologies to either sequester carbon or remove carbon that we can't just remove from the process on its own. But I think so on mass timber, Bill brought up the building code. So we're seeing a lot of movement, and Meta could speak to this as well. But I think one of the things that's been really interesting to watch in terms of mass timber is just how this is an example of a material that is a solution for reducing embodied carbon, but it's also a new material that people have to figure. Architects had to learn how to detail buildings differently. Contractors have to figure out how to construct buildings differently. There's new code changes that need to happen. And for all that, to overcome those barriers to using in buildings required architects to be really excited about using mass timber. It's a beautiful material. People want to use it. And that's why they're willing to go the extra step to say, I'm going to show up to code committee meetings, which most people are not super excited to show up for, to advocate for this to be able to be built in my city. And so I think what we need to see is more of that excitement around other new types of materials, whether that's other bio-based, Meta mentioned bio-based insulations. When we start to think about having to retrofit our buildings, there's specific technologies that can be integrated into some of the manufacturing processes of other materials, but that requires a learning curve, and there needs to be that passion there. And so I see mass timber as a carbon solution, potentially depending on how it's sourced, but also as an example of the kind of advocacy that will be required to get other new materials into buildings.
Right. What I'd like to add is we have to be a little bit careful with mass timber to think of it as a sort of something that is just a substitution, because every forest is different, and the Canadian forest that produces, cross-laminated timber is very different from, let's say, the American Northeast forests, which have smaller trees and so forth, and don't lend themselves necessarily to the same kind of panelized system. So what I would urge is that, to look at mass timber and timber itself as something good, but also to really look at the local condition and how, the choice of a particular material can in fact impact forest and even forest production upstate or in other places of the state or the country.
Great. And a really fun question just came in for Megan. Megan, if you could create your dream ideal carbon reduction policy package with the highest efficacy by 2030, which key policies would you include?
It's going to be a really specific, wonky answer, but someone asked it. So I think I'd like to see, in addition to the policies we're seeing now, which set carbon footprint limits on materials, I'd like to see the US also, very complementary policies, want to highlight, but also set carbon footprint limits per square foot on buildings. So the same way that energy is being limited at the scale of the building, I think we can do that with embodied carbon. And the sooner we start doing that, the better, because it gives us more time to develop strategies we need to get more and more reductions.
In fact, for those who are not familiar with Local Law 97 in New York, what it is addressing specifically now is it's limiting in certain size buildings the quantity of operating, is it emissions or no? It's operating energy for emissions.
Carbon caps.
Right, it's a carbon cap per square foot for the building. So it's up to the architects and design decide how to compare it. And so what we're saying is that if you can do it for operating energy or operating emissions, why not do it for embodied emissions as well? To bring that on after.
Right, and that would essentially be an augmentation of the benchmarking law. I mean, right? So you would essentially add the embodied emissions of each building, and the city already has the energy information of hundreds of thousands of buildings, because of that. So, and I actually think that could lead even to a greater understanding of, buildings and cities as sort of material repositories. And if we sort of think about buildings and potential deconstruction and disassembly and actually reusing materials from sort of a building that has sort of gone on living for, let's say, 50 years and moving that to another building, and very radical and interesting adaptive reuse, we could potentially think about, all buildings in the city as sort of these repositories of potential materials. And I think that is a very fascinating and innovative way of actually thinking about buildings and cities as, and especially if we think of increasing the amounts of materials that actually sequester carbon, we can really develop a kind of an urbanism that is about, the city as a kind of an answer to the climate crisis.
I'd like to focus.
That's actually one of the. I was just going to say that's one of the policies I meant to highlight earlier, is that Portland also has a deconstruction policy where they're doing that. They're starting to see buildings as material banks, and it's a great way to be extending the life of materials. So you never have to have those manufacturing processes that create emissions. And the other thing I would say is just that, and this has come up a couple times, I think, in Bill's comments as well as Ken's earlier, about how this can be tied to other types of policies. So really agree with Meta in terms of how this can be pulled into benchmarking policies that look at operational carbon to think about a whole life carbon. But there's also, so Washington State's has a bill right now on Buy Clean, Buy Fair, and as an example of how labor and working conditions in facilities and supply chains can also be brought into this conversation at the same time as when we're looking at the environmental impact of materials. And so I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in the next 5 years as we start to see more and more of these types of policies as to how they can also tie into these other really important issues.
I'd like to just focus. Oh, go ahead, Ken. Go ahead.
Yeah, can I just add one thing? 2022 to 2027 is a very short period of time. In that time period, we need to really start reducing emissions immediately. So we push the period out. In other words, if we can reduce the emissions by 50%, that means we'd have twice as long to deal with it. So we'd have to 2032. So I just want to urge that when people look at this, they sort of figure out what are the measures that can have immediate impact, that we can get on a broad enough, that we can scale up broadly enough. In other words, we've got to scale it. And there are thousands of local jurisdictions in 50 states and federal government. And what can we do that scales this up very, very quickly? And then if we can start reducing the emissions, then we can start bringing all the other things in as time goes on. We can bring all the other steps that have to be taken on this. So it's just a question. I just want to point out the priority in figuring out what can be scaled and be effective in a very short period of time.
Right, that's what I was going to try to do. You did it for me. It's the focus is back on 22 to 27. And there's one key and missing element here, which we have not discussed. And nothing's going to happen unless we fix it. And that's the tools for architects, engineers, and designers to use to figure out how much, before you build a building, not after. So you can make your choices as far as embodied carbon. And so, there's two problems here. One is there is no real depository of information that's sufficient for architects to use to figure out, how much embodied carbon will be in this building they want to construct, because a lot of it is done by mass. It's how many kilograms of emissions per kilogram of material. But if I'm buying a brick, or I'm buying some sheathing or whatever it might be, I'm not buying it by weight. And even if you want to buy a brick or let's say vinyl siding or laminate material, well, each company's laminate is different as to what it's made of, how much vinyl is on it, how thick is it, and so we need some means of, and a lot of this information is out there, but we need to pull resources somehow to get within this next 5 years, a better dictionary of what these materials are, and that's why I'm talking about carbon footprint labeling. But then once you have that, then how do you add this all together? There are, I don't know, Megan, you know more about this than I do, 6, 7, 8, or whatever it is, different programs available, to assemble this information, but most of them are extremely awkward and difficult to use. So, one of the questions I throw out to you, Megan, is there any way that we might be able to get some standardized program where, this is the acceptable one for municipalities to use, to calculate embodied carbon?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see some harmonization among the tools that are available. So some are already integrated into software that architects use, which makes them a lot easier to use. That's not always the case. And I think what we're seeing is more and more of these sort of early design calculators trying to help architects make decisions faster and earlier. And I think that's great. I think for the sort of more detailed accounting that lets you think of buildings and having a carbon budget for buildings, there are a number of tools that are already out there. But I think there still needs to be some of that harmonization where we're using one standard in terms of how it's being measured. we're seeing more movement on that, frankly, in other places. So the Canadian government is moving towards having that kind of standard nationally, as well as more movement in Europe. I think Meta wants to jump in. I'll let her.
I also think that we can sort of simplify it a little bit to sort of understand the big picture, especially for designers and specifiers and building professionals. To me, as Bill said, cement and concrete, steel and aluminum are sort of the big, things. And, they affect mostly the structure and envelope. So this sort of focuses people's attention a little bit, right? And then that leads to an understanding that tall buildings are in fact worse than low ones, in part because of their demand on steel and concrete, right? And then what follows really is, that we can actually go from carbon emitting and heat absorbing and, materials to carbon sequestering materials. And that again is sort of like a logical sort of way of thinking about it and sort of breaking down the problem at the very beginning of the process.
There is one piece in terms of tools that I think is already more available, which is something called an environmental product declaration, which is we call a nutrition label for building materials. So for that piece, those are already spreading rapidly, and you can find those. We have lots of resources on our website. I won't talk about it more here.
Well, I think that's just about time. I know we have kind of a hard stop at 1:30, but thank you all to all of the panelists so much for the really great conversation. It was great to see you all kind of bouncing ideas off of each other and responding to points that each other had made. I'll turn it back to Madison at the Environmental Law Institute for any sort of closing remarks, but thank you, and thanks to all of you for watching.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. One quick note for the audience. I did receive word that we will be emailing out a discount code to everyone who attended today's webinar for Bill Kaplan's book, if you're interested. So be on the lookout for that. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in today and to thank Bill, Ken, Maida, Megan, and Maxine for all of their time and energy working on this event. It has been so informative. And I just want to thank you again and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.